Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
The scripture reading for today comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from the heart."
Well, everyone, I'm joined by Seth Neckers, our associate pastor, who actually preached last week. He and I alternated the last 2 weeks, and we preached the same scripture, the story of the Good Samaritan. And one of the points that we were both trying to make, and I thought Seth did a great job last week of just emphasizing how proximity is one of the ways that we break down barriers, that as long as there's distance between people, it's easy to stereotype, it's easy to judge, but as soon as you get to know someone, you see past those barriers and those walls, and that it all begins to break down. And we see this in the story of the Good Samaritan, that the first thing he did is that he came near the man who was wounded, whereas everyone else passed on the other side of the street. And so one of the things we want to encourage you to do as we talk about the art of neighboring is that just that practice of coming near to your neighbor. And on our website, we have a neighborhood bingo card that you can go and download. It's a great way to just kind of test and grow your knowledge of your neighbor. There's 8 little boxes representing the 8 homes that are, right around you, and it asks you simple questions. Do you know names? Do you know something about them? And do you know ways that you can be praying for them or serving them? And so I encourage you to do that as a way of kind of, breaking down those barriers that exist between us and our neighbors. But here's the thing. Yes, proximity can break down barriers, but proximity can also build walls and barriers, because the reality is that relationships are messy, and sometimes it's harder to love someone up close than it is just to love them at a distance. Like sometimes it's easier to love our neighbors on the other side of the world because we don't really know them, but when you get to know your neighbors, sometimes there are challenges involved. Like every time we preach about Jesus says, love your neighbor, someone will raise their hand and say, well, hold on there. You haven't seen my neighbor. If you know my neighbor, you would give me a pass, right? And all of us have lived next to someone who's been hard to love. I mean, whether it's they let their dog poop on your grass, or they play their music too loud, or they borrow your tools and break them, and there's something that
Or in the 4th of July season, whether they wait to just about to fall asleep and then shoot fireworks off, or right after you put your baby down for sleep, they shoot off fireworks.
And we were talking between services today about lawn care, and like it goes both ways. One, there's always that neighbor that never cuts the grass. That I think you said
you could bale it.
You can bale it, like they're trying to sell, like it goes so high. There's those neighbors, and then on the flip side, the opposite extreme, you have those neighbors that report you to the HOA because you have 3 dandelions. And this is the reality that as you love your neighbors, there's all kinds of petty stuff that gets in the mix of it, and it becomes barriers in and of itself. So proximity doesn't solve all of our problems. When we get close to people, we realize that to love them, we need to learn to not just get along, but also to forgive. And so today we're going to talk about not just the art of neighboring, but the art of forgiving.
Yeah, forgiving is essential to neighboring. It's essential to being a good neighbor. But it's essential really to being a Christian. And that's why we've gone to this just seminal text in the story of the life of Jesus, where it starts out with Peter coming to Jesus and saying, how many times should I forgive somebody who sins against me? He's up to 7 times? Now, it's important to note, Peter was actually being pretty generous with this.
I think so. 7 times is hard to forgive.
I don't think I would let somebody sin against me 7 times. I'd be pretty frustrated and calloused by that point. But it was 3. In that day, the rabbis said that you should forgive somebody 3 times, right? You get 3 strikes and then you're out. You don't have to forgive them anymore. Peter's saying, should I give them up to 7 times? Jesus goes even further. He says, not 7 times, but 7 times 70 times, or 77 times. It can really be translated either way. Different translations take it differently. But that was really just a way of saying in that day, infinitely, like a gajillion times, without end, continue to forgive. And then he told the parable that we read, this story, what we call the parable of the unmerciful servant. And it starts out with this king who's calling in the debts of money that's owed to him. And he calls in a servant who it says owed him 10,000 talents. Our translation we looked at said bags of gold, but it was literally talents. And for us in America, it's well, what does that mean, right? It's not U.S. dollars. It's 10,000 yen
or rupees
or pesos.
What is that?
We don't know, how much that is off the cuff. But the New Testament scholar Craig Keener says that 10,000 talents would have been the equivalent, depending at different times in antiquity, between 60 and 100 million days' wages, right? Just an unfathomable amount of debt, right? That would just never be able to be paid. And that was the point in the story, that this is such a high amount of debt. This guy is never, ever going to be able to pay it. And he says, though, have mercy on me, I'll pay it back.
Yeah.
Never going to happen, but the master just amazingly forgives him. And that is so important to note in this story, right? Just the grace and mercy that the master showed. It reminds us that the love of God, the forgiveness that God offers, is just unfathomably merciful, unfathomably gracious. That we ourselves could never pay off the debt for all of the things that we have done wrong, all the things we've left undone in our lives, all those sins that would be so myriad, so numerous, and yet God forgives us. In Jesus Christ, he forgives that debt to us. That should be something that we each joyfully receive, a gift that we are so thankful for, and a gift that changes us, grace that changes how we live our lives. Is that what we saw in the parable?
No.
No, we did not, right? What's the first thing this servant does? He's just forgiven this amazing, unfathomable amount of debt. He goes down, finds another servant who owes him, and shakes him down for money. Now it says in our parable, he owed him 100 denarii. Again, it said 100 silver coins in our translation to try to give it that scale. But 100 denarii, and that was the equivalent of about 100 days' wages, or several $1,000s.
Which is not insignificant,
Oh,
right?
No, not by any means. I mean, if somebody owed you thousands of dollars, you would want that money back But it's insignificant in comparison to how much this first servant had just been forgiven.
Like it's like comparing your own personal debt to the debt of our national debt, like that unfathomable amount. Like your personal debt may not be insignificant, but in comparison to the national debt, it is. Like it's that comparison that makes it so small.
Exactly. And you'd think this man who's just been forgiven this massive amount would be okay with forgiving this seemingly small thing. Yeah. But he didn't. The other servant pleads with him. His debtor pleads with him, says the exact same thing he said to the king, right? Just give me time, right? Be patient with me. I'll pay it back. And he actually could pay it back. But instead, he throws him in prison, right, until his debt can be paid. He gives him the same punishment that he was about to receive. He lobs that on him. Well, of course, when the word gets back to the master, to the king, he's furious. He's incensed. And he says, "You wicked servant. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And then it says, in anger, he handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed, which, as we said, was an amount that he never could pay back. And it's a very sobering story, a sobering reality. Jesus ends this with the words, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from the heart." It relates God's forgiveness to our forgiveness. And it's really challenging because there at the end, he says, from the heart, right? Like maybe if we've ever mediated a dispute between two kids, right? We tell them, well, you need to say you're sorry. Well, I'm sorry. And the other kid, you need to say that you forgive them. Well, I forgive you. Neither one of them is actually like sorry or forgiven the other one. But Jesus doesn't say that. He says, you must forgive them from the heart.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I want to invite you to reflect on a little bit is from the heart, because it's really forgiveness is about the heart, because it's in our heart where we hold on to the hurt, where we hold on to the anger and the wound and we nurse it, and that's the place where Jesus says you have to forgive. As Seth said, it's such a sobering thought that God would hold us accountable, that our forgiveness would hinge somewhat on whether we are able to forgive others. That's a scary thought. But I do think it speaks to the truth that when we cannot forgive others, we end up imprisoning ourselves. We end up punishing ourselves. Lewis Smedes is coined this quote that says, "To forgive someone else is to set a prisoner free and then to discover that the prisoner was you." That quote comes from a book of his called The Art of Forgiving. It kind of parallels The Art of Neighboring in terms of the title. And in the book, he describes a 4-step cycle of forgiveness. And I just want to kind of lay these out. It's a very simple, just kind of singular words, that there's hurt, then hate, then heal, then come together. And it annoys me to no end that he couldn't come up with a 4th H just to complete the symmetry of that.
Couldn't do it. He ran out of creativity.
He ran out at that point. But as we go through them, you'll see perhaps why the 4th step is a little bit different. So I'm just going to kind of walk us through these steps as he describes them. The first comes hurt, obviously. The whole reason you have to forgive is because someone has hurt you. And Lewis Smedes says, there's 3 dimensions to this hurt. It's personal. It was something that is done to you or directly affects you. It feels personal. Secondly, it's unfair. Like it's not something you deserve. It's not some karmic payback for your own wrongdoing. I didn't deserve this at all. And then most importantly, it's deep. It's not a surface scratch. It's something that hurts you deeply. And when you experience that kind of hurt that's personal, unfair, and deep, what do most of us do? Well, most of us, what we try to do is we bury that hurt, right? Like we soften it, we minimize it, we explain it away, or we excuse it. And that's a defense mechanism for all of us because we don't want to hurt. But Smedes says that for the cycle of forgiveness to start, we have to begin by acknowledging the hurt, facing it and naming it, recognizing that this hurt has affected me. It's affected my relationships. It's affected my life. First thing we have to do is acknowledge the hurt. Then after hurt, he says, comes hate. We don't like that word, hate, right? We like the word anger instead, perhaps. And Smead says anger is different from hate. Anger, he says, is the executive power of human decency. Like there are things that happen in our world that we should be angry about. But anger becomes hate when we attach it to a singular person or a group of people and we actively wish for harm to come to them. That's when our anger becomes hate. And hate can be passive, like I'm not going to do anything to actively hurt you, but I'm going to wish that someday, sometime, you get what's coming to you. Or it can be aggressive, like I actively try to sabotage or undermine you or hurt you in some way, you know. But whether it's passive or aggressive, the thing about hate is that it combines with the hurt that was done in order to build walls. It's like one is the brick and the other is the mortar, and together they build walls between people. And we've probably all seen this before in a relationship where in the past someone hurt another person. And then time goes by and that original kind of, person who did the hurt changes. And they're a different person and they want a relationship, but they can't have it. Why? Because the person who was hurt is still holding on to the hate. It's the hurt and the hate together that form the wall. So what do you have to do with the hate? Well, with the hurt, you have to face it and name it. With hate, we have to release it. We make an intentional choice to release someone else from the emotional debt that they owe us. We no longer actively wish for bad things to happen to them. We release them from that debt. And releasing is not easy, but Pastor Rick Warren puts it this way. He says, what we cannot release, we come to resemble. Forgiveness is what keeps our attacker from remaking us in his or her image. We have to learn to let go and release so that we can move forward. So after we face the hurt and acknowledge it and then release the hate, the next thing that happens is we heal. And healing, Smead describes as an experience of peace, shalom, a peace with the other person, but also an internal peace that you feel in your heart. And one of my favorite stories that I think illustrates this is a story that Corrie ten Boom used to always tell. Corrie ten Boom, if you're not familiar with her, is a Holocaust survivor. And she tells the story that, as she would go to churches and speak in different churches, one evening after she finished her talk, a man approached her. And this man, introduced himself and he said, I was a prison guard at Ravenbrook, the concentration camp where Corrie ten Boom lived with her sister and where her sister died. And this man said, I was a guard at this concentration camp. And in the years since, he had become a Christian. And he said, I know I've been forgiven, but I need to hear it from someone. I need to hear it from you. Will you forgive me? And he extended his hand to Corrie. And in that moment, Corrie said she was just frozen. I mean, she didn't know how to respond to this man holding out his hand, because to shake his hand in some ways, it felt like he was asking her to excuse his sister's death. And I'll just pick up from there with her words. She said, I stood there with coldness clutching my heart. Forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that. I knew that forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. So I just prayed silently, help me, God. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You have to supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one that was stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder. It raced down my arm. It sprang into our joined hands, and this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried, with all my heart. And for a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. I love that story. the picture of shalom and peace, former guard and former prisoner, and God's love being present in the midst of it. I love that story, but I also want to caution you, it's not always that immediate. Forgiveness is not a one-time event. It is a process that goes on, because sometimes you think you've forgiven and then the hurt and the hate just kind of come back up and you got to repeat the cycle again. You have to continually face the hurt, continually release the hate until you eventually see the healing, happen in your life. And you know that you will have arrived when you have that sense of shalom, a sense of peace in your own spirit and a wishing of peace for the person who harmed you. In that time, you can feel like, okay, I finally am healed in my spirit. I can release them to God to follow their own path, and I can seek good in my own life as well. And then comes the final step, coming together. And I think perhaps one of the reasons that wasn't an H word is that Smead says this is an optional step. It's not always possible to reconcile with someone, and it's not even necessary sometimes, especially if the other person is still actively hurting you. You can't be in a relationship with them. And so you can do the hurting and the healing and the hurting and hating and healing. You can do that process internally in your own heart. That's forgiveness. But when you come together, that is an external experience, and that is reconciliation. I say to people all the time, forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same things. Mm-hmm. The two hang together, but reconciliation requires something more. And Smead puts it this way. He says, when they, the wrongdoers, take your hand and cross over the invisible wall that their wrong and your hate have built between you, they need to carry something with them as the price of their ticket for your second journey together. And if they cannot or will not pay their fare, you just have to settle for your own inner healing, your private freedom from hate, your own inner peace. So what must they bring? Truthfulness. Truthfulness. You can forgive someone without their truthfulness. Again, that's an internal process in your own spirit. But you can't have a relationship with someone without truthfulness, especially if they have hurt or wronged you in some way. It requires them to confess what they've done, to acknowledge the hurt they've caused, to acknowledge all the ways it's impacted your life, and then going forward, a renewed commitment to honesty and trust together. Truthfulness is the foundation of that second journey together. So you put the whole cycle together, and I just want you to see this again, that you face the hurt, and you release the hate, and you give it time for this process to bring healing into your lives, and then hopefully, possibly someday we come together with truthfulness and with peace, shalom between us. Now, there's probably lots of ways that you can apply this cycle. Like for me, I can't help but think about what's going on in our country and the hurt that exists between races and the hate and the healing that needs to happen. This is a process that I think we have to do over and over again as a country. But you can probably also apply it. I mean, not probably. We must apply it in our own individual lives and relationships. You can probably think of a member of your family or a coworker or a boss or a neighbor, someone where that has hurt you and you need to go through this process, or someone where you've hurt them and you need to bring your own truthfulness. And so my hope is that you can apply this process to your life. And Seth is going to share a few applications that come from our Art of Neighboring book.
Yeah, because we want to think about how do we live this out with the people who live closest to us. That's the theme of our series here. And in the book, Young and Empathic gives some really great tips on thinking about situations that happen in our neighborhoods and how we can bring forgiveness into them. And it's a 5-step process. We were doing multiple processes here. They give 5 basic steps. And the first is to identify the issue and assess its severity.
Yeah, this is like facing the hurt, right?
Yeah, and it's really coming in from a sense of humility and realizing that relationships are a two-way street. Like we have a part in that, they have a part in that. We need to understand and acknowledge the hurt that's been done and understand our part in it and their part in it. The second is to choose to obey Jesus' command to pray for those who are your enemies. And it's funny because this is like the thing that you don't want to do. Right? If somebody has hurt you, if they have harmed you, if they've sinned against you, you are not going to want to pray for them. You're not going to want to pray for their well-being, that God would bless them, that God would help give you the same eyes and heart that he has for them. But that's exactly what we have to do. It's kind of that action that we take and then the feelings follow after that, that we need to be praying for that person, that God will work in our heart as well as that situation. The third is that if you are convicted by God of wrongdoing, look for an opportunity to apologize for your part in a matter. Now again, because relationships are two-way, they may have sinned against us in very significant ways. But so oftentimes, we have also sinned against them, maybe in retaliation, or it becomes this tit for tat. It can be a cycle. And so we have to break that cycle. We need to acknowledge the sins that we've committed against them. And not because God hasn't forgiven us, right? That's the beautiful message, that we've been forgiven, just as that guard in Ravensbrück concentration camp, how he understood God had forgiven him, but he sought out Corrie ten Boom's forgiveness. That we have the opportunity to ask for forgiveness from those who we've sinned against. If not just for the chance of reconciliation, but that they might be released from that cycle that they're trapped in, the hatred that they're feeling, the walls that have been built between us. That's really the only way that reconciliation can happen, is if we're willing to take that step. We should be willing as Christians to be the people who take that first step. Fourth is to go the extra mile. And really, this is just thinking about, if the roles were reversed, if I was the one in their shoes, how would I want to be treated? And beyond that, what extravagant way could I show the love that I have for this person, the desire to make things right? And really, it brings us to our fifth, which is find an indirect way to bless people. And this is specifically for if you can't reconcile that situation. If it's the kind of situation where things would actually get worse by directly engaging them, might make animosity increase, we ask ourselves, well, how can I continue to live near this person and be a good neighbor to them? How can I be a blessing even if it's in small ways from afar?
Right. And they may not know or see what you're doing, but that's not the important part. It's not about their heart being changed. It's really about your heart being changed and being open to the next person. I want to take you back. We're going to close, but I want to take you back to the parable of the unforgiving or unmerciful servant. When Jesus tells this story, I think his intention is for us to place ourselves in the position of that servant. Mm-hmm. And he's prompting the question for all of us is, where is our focus? Is our focus on the 100 denarii that other people owe us, the debt that we are owed, or can we focus on the 10,000 talents, the great debt, the forgiveness that we have all received? Because the thing is as Seth said earlier, it's the fact that forgiveness did not change the servant's heart. Like, that's where the condemnation comes in. Mm-hmm. He experiences forgiveness, but it's to that servant, it's just a transaction, a canceling of debt. It doesn't penetrate and change his heart. There's no transformation. And so he doesn't even experience the fullness of grace. I read a quote years ago, and I don't even know where I read it, who said it, but it's always stuck with me. It goes like this. It says, grace is most needed where it has longest been absent. Grace is most needed where it's longest been absent. And I'm sure you can think of a relationship or a person where grace has long been absent. It might be a member of your family, it might be a boss or coworker or neighbor. It might even be in your own heart that you feel like it's been a long time since you gave yourself grace. But grace is most needed where it has long as been absent. I just want to ask you, in that relationship with whoever you might come to mind, what would it look like to bring grace into the picture? And the reality is that grace doesn't guarantee that the relationship will be mended. It doesn't. Neither does it guarantee that the other person's heart is going to change. I mean, as we saw in today's story, the king's forgiveness didn't really change the heart of the unmerciful servant. It doesn't guarantee that. But what grace does do is, I think, two things. First, grace keeps our heart from turning against our neighbor. And secondly, grace invites our neighbor to respond differently to us. When we respond to our neighbor in anger, we invite them to go to war with us. But when we respond to our neighbor with grace, we invite them to come to the table with us. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He comes and he makes peace. He extends grace in order to invite us to the table with him. He invites us to this table, the sacrament of communion. And it doesn't matter what sin we are carrying, how unfaithful we've been, or what harm someone has done to us. The condition of our hearts, it doesn't matter what we've done. We are invited to come and receive the fullness of God's grace. And as we experience that grace and forgiveness and love and freedom, we are invited for our hearts to be transformed. I am convinced that our hearts don't look the same on the other side of grace. It's on the other side of this meal, on the other side of Christ's forgiveness. Only then are we truly set free to love and forgive our neighbor the way Christ calls us to.